Current practices of special education. In this presentation, we will cover the referral process, individualized education plans, placement, and teaching strategies. First, let's start with the referral process. The following flowchart is the referral process for special education assessment and support services. You'll notice the flowchart starts with school staff noticing academic, social, or behavioral concerns for a particular student. The student is then referred to the school learning support team, sometimes called the multidisciplinary team. The learning support team then gives teachers instructional or behavioral interventions to use with the student. After at least a month of the intervention, the teacher will then provide a summary of the results. If the intervention was successful, then they can continue the intervention and monitor the student. If the intervention was unsuccessful, a referral can be made for a special needs assessment. The Regional Special Education Services conducts a student assessment. The assessment outcomes are delivered at a parent meeting conducted by the region. Based on the assessment, the student may or may not qualify for special education services. If the student does not qualify, then the discussion of need for educational accommodations occurs and provided to the school learning support team to develop an IEP. If the student qualifies for educational services based on the eligibility criteria, the team with the parent develop the IEP or the ALP. The ALP is an alternative learning placement. Placement is determined and support services are provided to the school. Next, each academic year, the Regional Special Education Services convenes a review meeting to examine the progress of the student. The IEP or ALP is reviewed and updated where necessary. Every 3 years, the student is reappraised and information is updated in the areas of concern. Let's look at the Individualized Education Plan. The Individualized Education Plan is for a student with one or more disabilities. It can be written for a year or for a month, depending on the goal. It's a very important document. Here in the UAE, the IEP is not a legal document, unlike in other countries such as the US. Typically, developed by a team that includes teachers, parents, and a learning support team, or as mentioned before, sometimes called a multidisciplinary team. The Individualized Education Plan, or the IEP, includes the child's present level of performance, which includes the child's strengths and weaknesses for subject matter and for behavioral concerns, the needs of the child, goals and objectives, accommodations and modifications when necessary, related services, and transition goals. Goals should be written based on a SMART technique. S stands for specific, so the goal should relate to a specific skill, ability, or behavior. M stands for measurable. The skill, ability, or behavior should be quantifiable, observable, or measurable. You should be able to see the behavior in order to count the outcome. A, the goal should be achievable. The skill, ability, or behavior needs to be something that the child can actually achieve. R is realistic. It's important that we focus on what the student is able to do and not necessarily what they should be doing. And T is for timely. We want to make sure that the goal is age appropriate and that the student will be able to complete the goal in a reasonable amount of time. Here's an example of a SMART goal. When given 3-digit numbers, the student will correctly solve at least 18 out of 20 problems in 3 out of 5 trials. Notice the goal is extremely specific. By saying we'll correctly solve, we can observe the student's behavior. If we wrote something as will identify or will understand, we're not able to see what the child is thinking. If we say they can understand how to add, we need to make sure we can see the result. So by saying they will correctly solve, we're able to actually see their numerical answer. We also give the child 3 out of 5 trials. So we're saying we'll give the child at least 20 questions 5 times. And out of those 5 times, 3 of the times, the child needs to score at least 18 correct. And this is focusing on 3-digit numbers. Let's look at some terms to see if they're measurable or not measurable. If you look under the column of measurable, you'll see the words draw, turn in, state, trace, label, match, and retell. Notice all of these words are observable. You can physically see a child draw or turn work in. You can hear a child state whatever the requirement is. You can also see them trace. You can watch them label. You can watch them match different criteria together, and you can hear them retelling a story, retell sequences, etc. Now let's look at the not measurable side. If we're writing a goal, we want to stay away from this column. Words such as determine, identify, understand, improve, respect, care, and appreciate are all very abstract and not able to see in a confident way. For example, what does respect actually mean? Respect varies based on cultural norms and various opinions. So using the word respect leaves a lot of room for gray area. So do the words care and appreciate. If you look at the word understand, as I mentioned before, we're not able to see inside of a child's mind to know if they understand or if they comprehend. We need to make sure that they retell something, or that they state, or that they're able to solve. We want to physically see so that we can observe and measure the goal. When looking at the IEP, teachers should write lesson plans including the IEP goals and objectives for each child. This includes the general education teacher as well as the special education teacher. The IEP is important to help children with disabilities learn what they need. Oftentimes their needs are different than the students who do not have an IEP, which is why it's an individualized education plan. We cannot fail children with disabilities based on UAE Federal Law 2009. Teachers are expected to teach all children in inclusive classrooms. All students can learn. The Individualized Education Plan also includes accommodations and modifications. Accommodations change the representation of the work or the presentation of the work, while modifications change the level or the content of the work. So let's look at the accommodation side. We have extended time, note-taking assistance, a sign language interpreter, braille, text-to-speech, small group instruction, and preferential seating. These are just some samples of accommodations that some students may need in the classroom to be successful. If you look at these accommodations, you'll notice that none of the accommodations change the assignment or the instructions of an assignment. Now let's look at the modifications. Less work on assignments, fewer answer choices on tests, writing to the level of understanding, responses are accepted in shorter or less time-consuming formats, and there's a grading criteria is often changed. Looking at modifications, you'll notice that the difficulty level of the work is usually changed, which is why it's a modification. You're modifying the work for the student to be successful. So accommodations change the presentation of the work, but they do not change the content. And modifications change the content or the difficulty of the work to help the students be successful. Now let's take a quick look at placements. If you look at this triangle at the very bottom, this is the regular education classroom, and it's the largest part of the triangle. And all the way at the top, you'll have a center-based school, which is the most restrictive. So everywhere in between falls between less restriction from little to least restrictive, which is the general education classroom. Next, you may be in the regular education classroom, but it may be based on special education support. So maybe you have an assistant, or it's a co-teach classroom with a co-teacher or something like that. You could also have a regular education class with school-based educational support, such as maybe a teacher comes into the classroom and works with a small group of students, or maybe the student is pulled out of the classroom to be taught in an individualized setting for small amounts of time for different subject areas. You can also have regular education and special education classrooms. So maybe for some parts of the day, the student may be in math and social studies in the regular education classroom, and maybe for English, they're moved to the resource classroom, or they have special education services for particular subjects. You can also move up to even more restriction by having special education classes full-time. So even though the student may be attending a public school, they might be in a special education classroom for the entire day. At the very top, we have center-based schools for students who have more severe disabilities or more particular disabilities. Sometimes they're placed in a particular school that focuses on that particular disability. Inclusive classrooms often include the following disabilities: mild learning disabilities, hearing impairments, visual impairments, physical disabilities, mild intellectual disabilities, autism, gifted and talented, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, emotional or behavioral disorders, and other health impairments. So what about the students who have more severe disabilities? Well, oftentimes these students are placed in a special center, hospitals, or they are at home. This was a beautiful quote by Nicole Eretix. I hope I said her name correctly. In the inclusive classroom, the teacher not only sets up physical opportunities for all students to look included, but the teacher makes students feel included through his or her choice of words and phrases. This is so important because children understand far more than adults give them credit for. And if the child needs to feel that they are included, not just look like they are included. Before we end this particular section, let's just look at 3 key teaching strategies. We'll look at the universal design for learning, differentiated instruction, and response to intervention. The universal design for learning has 3 main areas: representation, which is the purple bubble, action and expression, which is the blue bubble, and engagement, which is the green bubble. And UDL, or Universal Design for Learning, is where all 3 of those components meet together. Representation is about the content and how the information is presented through multiple modes of representation. So you're using visual cues, auditory views, hands-on, active, interactive learning, all for the content that's being presented. Engagement is all about getting the students motivated, doing different activities and making the content relate to their life so that they're engaged in what's being said and what's being taught. And the final one is action and expression, and that is how you allow students to show you, the educator, what they learn. Are you only providing tests such as worksheets, or are students able to write poems or sing songs or write a story about what they learned? It's all about different ways of expression. So the universal design for learning in a nutshell is using representation, engagement, action, and expression to help students be more engaged and focused on the content in an actively engaged way. Next, we have differentiated instruction. Teachers can differentiate the content, the process, and the product. The content is the information. The process is how the students practice that information, and the product is how the students show what they learned from the information. Now, differentiation should be based on the student's readiness or ability level, their interest, and their learning profile, which is if they're an auditory, kinesthetic, or visual learner. Now, the auditory, visual, and kinesthetic, they're not scientifically based saying that a student only learns one particular way. We all learn in a combination of auditory, visual, and kinesthetic. So if we're able to tap into those different learning styles, then we're able to engage students and get them more motivated to learn the content. So it's important that when teachers or parents or whoever is teaching something, when they differentiate, that it's not just based on the student's ability level. we don't want to only group students by high level, medium level, and low level. We definitely, if we're using readiness, we definitely want to make sure that we mix the groups of students together. You don't always want to separate them by high learners are always together. Students who may be in the lower group, they may have creative ideas and really interesting ways of looking at things that can motivate the medium learner or the higher learner. So we want to make sure that we integrate those groups together. And finally, there's response to intervention. Now, response to intervention is oftentimes used as a whole school model. It could also be used in the classroom. It's just normally used on a larger scale. So in Tier 1, you have 3 tiers. There's Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. Tier 1 is universal interventions, or that use of the universal design for learning. So it's available to all students in the classroom. It can consist of a whole group or individual strategies or supports. This is more like the general education classroom with some supports to help the students who may not be achieving. If the general supports are helping certain students, then they'll stay in Tier 1. But if those supports are still not enough, then those students that it's not working for will receive Tier 2 interventions, which are more individualized. It's usually like small group instruction. It's targeting the students who need just a bit more focused instruction. If the interventions are still not working, then there is Tier 3, which are intensive interventions, and oftentimes a student is then referred to special education, where that whole referral process that we started with would come into play. So just to review, we looked at the referral process here in the United Arab Emirates, the Individualized Education Plan, and the different components in the plan. We looked at some placement options and a few teaching strategies. Those are the current practices.